My father looked me dead in the eye and told me my brothers deserved more money than me because they were men. Said I'd probably get married one day and leave anyway, so why invest in me? 6 years I gave that man's company. 6 years of impossible clients, missed weekends, and problems my brothers created that I quietly cleaned up. He laughed when I quit. Actually laughed. What he didn't know was that his biggest clients already had my number saved.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. Let me tell you something about growing up a Mitchell. In our house, competence was the language of love. My father, Gerald Mitchell, built his property management company from a folding table in our basement. By the time I was in high school, Mitchell and Associates had a real office, a real staff, and a reputation in the commercial real estate community that made people sit up straighter when they heard the name. I believed in that. Genuinely believed in it. My mother, Renee, ran the household the same way Gerald ran the business. Everything in its place. No room for weakness, appearances maintained at all costs. She grew up with very little and married into something she considered a miracle, and she protected it accordingly. Then there were my brothers. Damon is 3 years older than me. Handsome in the way that opens doors, charming in the way that makes people forget to ask follow-up questions. He went to business school, graduated somewhere in the middle of his class, and came back to Mitchell and Associates like he was doing the company a favor. Troy is 2 years younger than me. He has Damon's confidence without the charm to back it up. He got through his degree on extensions and family patience, then walked into a job title that had been waiting for him like a seat saved at church. And then there's me, Vanessa. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a concentration in real estate finance. I turned down 2 other job offers to come work for my father because I genuinely believed, that in our family, what you produced was what you were worth. I was 22 years old and I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. I started as a property coordinator and worked my way into managing some of the firm's most demanding accounts. Not because anyone handed it to me, because every time a crisis came up, whoever was holding the phone called Vanessa. Difficult tenant dispute? Vanessa. Major client threatening to walk? Vanessa. Contractor who stopped showing up in the middle of a renovation? You already know. My brothers had the titles. I had the actual work. For 6 years, I told myself this was temporary, that Gerald was building towards something, that merit would eventually speak. I was still telling myself that story the morning I went to make copies of the Whitfield lease addendum and found someone else's payroll report sitting in the output tray. I almost didn't look at it. I picked it up intending to set it on the counter for whoever forgot it, and then my eyes landed on the column headers, and then on the names. Damon Mitchell, $95,000. Troy Mitchell, $88,000. Vanessa Mitchell, $42,000. I stood at that copy machine for a long time, long enough that the machine went to sleep, long enough that 2 people walked past me in the hallway, and I didn't register either of them. $42,000. I manage Morrison Properties, Whitfield Commercial, and the entire downtown office corridor. Accounts that together represented nearly 60% of the company's annual revenue. I had personally saved the Blackstone relationship twice in 3 years. Once when a heating system failed across 4 buildings in January, and once when a contractor we'd used for years turned out to be double billing. I had built client relationships that required actual trust, not just a firm handshake and an expensive lunch. Damon took long lunches with institutional clients and called it business development. Troy managed a development project portfolio that moved slowly enough that his mistakes took months to surface, by which point I had usually already quietly fixed them. $42,000. I made copies of the report. I folded them and put them in my jacket pocket. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat at my desk until I could feel my hands again. By the time I went home that evening, I had made a decision. I was going to give this family the benefit of the doubt one last time. I was going to walk into that HR office with documentation, with performance records, with the kind of evidence that doesn't leave room for interpretation. And I was going to believe, right up until the moment I couldn't anymore, that my father was a reasonable man. I know. I spent 4 evenings building my case. I pulled every performance review I'd received in 6 years, all of them strong, most of them exceptional. I compiled client retention data for every account I managed. I put together a side-by-side breakdown of responsibilities, what I handled, what Damon handled, what Troy handled, with timeline documentation for every major project. I requested a formal compensation review meeting with Paulette, our HR manager. Paulette had been with Mitchell and Associates for 15 years. She was professional, thorough, and genuinely good at her job. I'd always respected her. I thought she'd at least engage with the materials. She didn't. I sat across from her with a manila folder full of evidence, and she glanced at the top page, set her pen down, and looked at me with the expression of a woman who already knew exactly how this ended. "Vanessa," she said carefully, "I hear your concerns about compensation equity." Concerns was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I had a $43,000 gap between my salary and my younger brother's. That is not a concern. That is a policy. "I think this conversation would really be better had directly with your father," she continued, already reaching for her desk phone. "Let me see if he has a few minutes." She made the call before I could respond. 5 minutes later, I was gathering my folder and walking down the hall toward Gerald's office. Paulette followed me in and sat in the corner chair with her notepad open, her pen ready, and her eyes pointed very carefully at the floor. She knew. She had known the whole time. Gerald's office had a massive oak desk that he'd had custom built in the early years of the company. He liked it because it was large enough to make whoever sat across from it feel slightly small. He looked at my folder, the way a man looks at a grocery list someone handed him that he didn't ask for. "Baby girl," he started. I felt something go quiet inside me. Not anger. Something colder than anger. The particular stillness that comes when you realize you have been operating under a completely false set of assumptions about the world. "I appreciate the initiative here," he said. "I really do. But I'm not sure you fully understand how compensation decisions get made in a business like ours." I told him to help me understand. He set the folder down without opening it. He leaned back in his chair. He talked about Damon's relationships with institutional clients and the weight of that responsibility. He talked about Troy managing the development portfolio and the liability exposure that came with it. He talked in the language of leadership and complexity and professional pressure. I let him finish. Then I told him that the Morrison account alone, which I managed entirely, including the emergency heating failure in February that required me to coordinate with 6 contractors and 2 city inspectors over 72 consecutive hours, represented more revenue than Damon's entire institutional client list. I told him I had the numbers in the folder if he wanted to look at them. His jaw moved slightly. "You're excellent at operations," he said. "That's not the question." "Then what is the question?" He was quiet for a moment. Paulette's pen had stopped moving. "Your brothers have families," he said finally. "They have financial responsibilities, career trajectories that require stability and growth." I waited. "You'll find someone, Vanessa. Get married, settle down. It doesn't make business sense to structure compensation the same way for someone who's likely—" He paused, found a softer word and discarded it, found a harder one and used it anyway. Temporary. Temporary. I had given that company 6 years. I had worked weekends. I had taken client calls on Christmas Eve. I had trained both of my brothers on processes I developed myself and then watched them receive credit for the outcomes. Temporary. "And let me be clear," he added, with the confidence of a man who has never once had to justify himself to his own family. "They're men, Vanessa. That matters in this industry. The way clients see leadership, the way the market works. It matters." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Paulette, who was studying her notepad with the intensity of someone reading scripture. "I see," I said. I stood up slowly. My legs felt steadier than they had any right to. I reached into my purse. I set my company credit card on his desk, then my parking pass, then my office key card. I lined them up neatly, edge to edge, the way my mother had taught me to set a table. "Consider this my 2 weeks' notice," I said. Gerald's face changed. The confidence shifted into something less comfortable. "Vanessa, let's not do anything hasty here. 2 weeks, I'll finish the Morrison transition and brief whoever you assign to my accounts. That's professional courtesy." "Who is going to hire you?" he asked. The question was supposed to land like a warning. Instead, it came out sounding genuinely curious, like he really wanted to know, like the answer had never occurred to him because he'd never had to think about it. I picked up my purse. "That's the wrong question, Dad." He raised an eyebrow. "The right question is who's going to keep your clients when I'm gone." I walked to the door. I heard him laugh behind me. Not the laugh of someone nervous, not the bitter laugh of someone losing, the laugh of someone who has just heard a joke they find funny and a little sad. Genuine amusement. That sound followed me down the hallway. It followed me home. It followed me into every moment of doubt I would have for the next year. And every single time I heard it in my memory, it made me work harder. Some people are motivated by encouragement. I am motivated by the very specific sound of a man who underestimated me finding something to laugh at. I did not spend my notice period being petty. I want to be clear about that because some people hear this story and assume I must have withheld information or left things in disarray or set some kind of slow-burning trap. I did not. I spent 14 days documenting everything I had ever built at that company. Client preference files, vendor contacts with personal notes on who was reliable and who would promise anything and deliver half, maintenance escalation protocols. The particular way misses. Elaine Whitfield liked to receive her quarterly reports, printed and mailed, not emailed, with a handwritten note on the cover page, because she was 81 years old and believed email was for people who didn't have time to be courteous. I was thorough because thoroughness is who I am, not because I was being gracious to Gerald, because I refused to let anyone say I left them unprepared. Damon was assigned to take over my accounts. He came into my office on day 3 of the transition with the Morrison file in his hands and an expression I had never seen on his face before. Damon was not a man who alarmed easily. He alarmed then. "Vanessa." He held up the file. It was nearly 4 inches thick. "You manage all of this? Every day?" "Every day." "The Blackstone situation in January. That was you? The contractor fraud? The city inspector situation was Tuesday afternoons for 6 weeks. The contractor had been billing for materials he was returning and keeping the credits. I caught it in month 3. Damon was quiet for a moment. "You never said anything?" "I handled it. That's what handling it means." He didn't say anything after that. He took the file and walked back to his office, and I watched him go and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, just a very clear sense that the ground was finally honest. Elaine Whitfield called me on my last Thursday. She did not call the main office line. She called my direct number, the one she'd had for 4 years. "I heard you're leaving," she said. No preamble. Elaine did not do preamble. "I am." "Your father's a fool. I've been in commercial real estate for 35 years, and I know what I'm looking at when I see it. You're one of the sharpest people I've worked with." She paused. "I want you to call me when you figure out what comes next." I wrote her name at the top of a blank page in the notebook I had bought for the occasion. It was the first entry. I filed my business license on a Thursday morning in March. Meridian Property Group, LLC. I said it out loud in my car in the parking lot of the county clerk's office, just to hear how it sounded. It sounded like something real. The office space I'd found was downtown, 3rd floor, 2 rooms and a reception area that currently held nothing but a folding table the previous tenant had left behind. The building was older but clean. The windows faced east. In the mornings, the light came in at an angle that made even a folding table look like it was somewhere worth being. I spent the first week furnishing it like a puzzle. A used desk from an estate sale, solid wood, good drawers, a small nick on the left front corner that I decided to leave because it meant the desk had history. A chair that had seen better decades, but still rolled. A coffee maker that was not fancy and was not quiet and produced the best cup of coffee I'd had since I stopped being able to afford the good beans. The reception area stayed empty. I couldn't staff it yet. Every dollar I had was either in operating costs or sitting in a reserve account I was not going to touch unless the situation became genuinely dire. I sat at my desk on the first real morning and I made a cup of coffee and I looked at the east-facing windows and I felt two things at the same time. A fear so specific it had a shape, and a freedom so clean it was almost physical. I let both of them sit there. Then I opened my laptop and started building the client intake system I'd been designing in my head for 6 years. Ms. Dorothy Kane knocked on my office door on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. She was my landlord. She was 63, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had owned her 3 small office buildings for 22 years through what she described as stubbornness and good insurance. She had heard through the small building owner network that I did not yet know existed that the woman in 3C was a property manager. "I've got 40 tenants across 3 buildings," she told me, settling into the chair I'd positioned across from my desk. "And right now, my version of a maintenance system is a notebook and a prayer. My last property manager retired in December, and I have not had a good night of sleep since." I asked her to describe the 3 most persistent problems she was dealing with. She described them. I took notes. By the time she finished, I had a preliminary service framework sketched out on the legal pad in front of me. We agreed on terms before she stood up. She was my first client. Her 3 buildings held 40 tenants. None of the units were large and the management fee was modest. But it was real. It was mine. And it gave me a proof of concept that I could point to when people asked if Meridian Property Group was a real company or just a name on a business card. Within 2 weeks, I had resolved a plumbing issue in her second building that had been ongoing since February. I renegotiated her cleaning contract and saved her 14% annually. I built a tenant portal that let people submit maintenance requests from their phones. Dorothy Kane called me on a Friday afternoon just to say that for the first time in 4 months, no one had complained to her directly about anything. Then she gave me 2 names. Both of them were small property owners she knew personally. Both of them needed help. Both of them called me within a week. That was month 1. Month 2 was harder. I want to be honest about that because I think people sometimes hear comeback stories and assume the momentum is constant. It is not. There are weeks where you sit in an office that is very quiet and you run the numbers, and the numbers are fine. Technically fine, operationally fine, and you still feel the specific weight of being entirely responsible for whether this thing lives or dies. I was handling everything myself. Client calls in the morning, vendor coordination through the afternoon, invoices and contracts in the evenings. I kept a running document of every process I built so that when I eventually had someone to hand things off to, the knowledge wasn't just in my head. I gave myself a salary from day 1, a real one, not a token one. Because one of the things I had learned from watching how Gerald ran his business was that the moment you stop paying yourself properly, you start making decisions out of scarcity instead of strategy. In week 6, a man named Marcus Webb contacted me about a mid-sized portfolio. 7 commercial properties, good locations, long-term tenants. He'd found me through one of Dorothy's referrals. We spent 2 weeks in conversation. I prepared a full-service proposal. He was engaged, asked good questions, seemed genuinely interested. Then he called on a Wednesday morning and told me he'd decided to go with another firm, his cousin's company. Nothing personal. I sat with that for about an hour. Then I went back to my intake notes from our conversations and looked at where I'd been stretching my projections to accommodate his portfolio's complexity. At 7 properties, I would have needed to hire before I was ready. I would have been growing to fit a client instead of growing because I was ready to grow. Losing Marcus Webb was not a failure. It was a correction. I went back to my original market segment. Small to mid-size commercial properties, underserved by the big firms, too complex for individual landlords to handle alone. I tightened my systems. I deepened my vendor relationships. I made my service model undeniably good at the thing it was designed to do. By month 3, I had 6 buildings under management and enough steady revenue to cover overhead with a real margin left over. It wasn't fast, but it was solid. And solid, I was learning, was worth more than fast. I was reviewing lease renewals for Dorothy's second building when the call came in. Unknown number, local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Meridian Property Group, this is Vanessa. A pause. Then, Vanessa, it's Paulette. I set down my pen. Her voice was careful in the way it had been careful that morning in her office. Professionally neutral, carrying something underneath it that she was choosing not to name directly. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, she started. I got your number from the business registry. It's fine. What's going on? There have been some changes with the Morrison account. She paused again. They've terminated their contract with Mitchell and Associates, effective last Friday. Morrison Properties, my account. 4 years of relationship building, of learning how Janet Morrison's team worked, of solving problems before they became emergencies. The account Damon had inherited with 4 inches of my notes and an expression like a man handed a live electrical panel. The client specifically asked if we had contact information for you, Paulette continued. They said they'd like to speak with you directly about their management needs going forward. I looked at the east-facing windows. The afternoon light had shifted. The office felt different than it had in March. Not because anything about the room had changed, but because I had. I appreciate you calling me, Paulette. Vanessa. She said my name differently this time, less professional, more tired. They didn't leave because of you. They left because of what happened after you. I just want you to know that. I know, I said. I built those relationships. I know how they work. Yes, she said. You did. I called Janet Morrison's direct line before I left the office that evening. Janet Morrison ran her facilities team the way I ran my client files, with precision, without tolerance for excuses, and with a very clear understanding of the difference between a problem being managed and a problem being explained. We met in a conference room downtown. She arrived first, which told me everything I needed to know about where her patience was. I'll be direct with you, she said before I had finished opening my portfolio. The last 4 months have been a customer service disaster. Maintenance requests that used to be acknowledged within 2 hours are sitting for days. Twice I've had tenant complaints escalate to formal letters because nobody from Mitchell's, responded in time. I understand. I don't think you need me to explain why we left. I think you already know. I do. What I need to know, she said, setting her hands flat on the table, is whether what we had before was the firm or whether it was you. That was the real question. That had always been the real question. It was the systems I built, I said, and the relationships I maintained, and yes, the standard I held myself to. All of that is what Meridian Property Group is built on. I walked her through my service model, the response protocols, the vendor network I'd spent 3 months building from scratch, the client communication framework, everything I developed over 6 years at Mitchell and Associates, rebuilt cleanly under my own name. Janet listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. This is what we used to get, she said. Before. Yes. Then let's talk about terms. We talked about terms for 45 minutes. We signed the contract that afternoon. I drove back to my office, parked the car, and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before going in. Morrison Properties was back. Not because of Gerald Mitchell's company, not because of a name on a building, because of me, I picked up my phone and texted Dorothy Kane. We just landed our first major account. She sent back a single line. I know you would. In commercial real estate, news moves faster than contracts. Within 3 weeks of the Morrison signing, I received calls from 3 other former Mitchell and Associates accounts. Richardson Development, whose facilities director had worked with me directly for 2 years. Patterson Holdings, whose owner had once told Gerald to his face that I was the only person at the firm who answered the phone like she meant it. Heritage Properties, whose retail complexes I had helped lease from 60% occupied to full in 14 months. Each call was the same story in different language. Something had changed after I left, and what had changed was the quality of attention. Problems sat. Calls went unreturned. The people who called themselves account managers were managing the account on paper and nothing else. I took every meeting. I was honest with each client about where Meridian was in its growth and what I could offer them right now versus what we were building toward. I did not overpromise. I did not take on more than I could handle excellently. I said no to one property owner whose timeline would have required me to hire 2 people in 30 days, which was too fast for the standard I'd committed to maintaining. The clients I did sign, I served at the level they'd had before. Not better than before. Exactly at that level, because that level had been set by me in the first place. By the end of month 5, I hired my first employee. Keisha came with a background in commercial operations and a direct, no-nonsense style that reminded me of Janet Morrison at about half the intimidation level. She took over the day-to-day coordination that had been eating my afternoons, which freed me to focus on client relationships and the next phase of growth. The office got its second desk. The reception area got a plant. It was not glamorous, it was just real, and real was what I had set out to build. Damon called on a Tuesday. He opened with, "How are you?" which told me the call had been rehearsed. "I'm well," I said. "What's going on?" He said he wanted to talk about what was happening in the market. He said he'd noticed some client transitions and wanted to understand the situation. He said, and this is the part I want you to hear clearly, that it seemed like I was damaging the family business. Damaging. As if the clients had not made their own decisions. As if they had not called me. As if my existence as a competent alternative in the marketplace was an act of aggression rather than a natural consequence of Gerald's choices. "Damon," I said, "do you remember what Dad told me about why my salary was what it was?" Silence. He told me my brothers had families to support. He told me I was temporary. He told me, and I'm quoting directly here, that they're men and I only spend money. I let that sit for a moment. Is that damaging the family business? Or is that the family business making its own damage and being surprised by the result? Damon said some things after that. They were not particularly coherent. The call ended. Gerald called 3 days later. He did not pretend the call was casual. He wanted to have lunch. He wanted to discuss what he called a collaborative arrangement. His description of this arrangement involved informal cross-referrals and shared resources. And the more he talked, the clearer the structure became. Mitchell and Associates would send me the accounts that were difficult, underperforming, or too small to matter. When I developed those accounts into something profitable, the relationship would be positioned as a partnership that benefited both firms. He would send me the problems. He would call it generosity. "Dad," I said, "what you're describing is outsourcing dressed up as partnership. You want me to handle the hard accounts so you can keep the profitable ones, and in exchange, I get access to a network I've already rebuilt on my own. That's not... What do I get from this arrangement that I don't already have?" He said, "Family support, access to his resources." I said, "Family support would have meant something a year ago. What I have now, I built without it. So respectfully, I'm not sure what you're offering." I heard him exhale. "Clara." He used my mother's name for me, the one from before I started going by Vanessa at work, a reaching back move. I'm trying to find a way forward here. So am I. Mine just doesn't involve working for you." I quoted his words back to him then. The exact ones. Temporary. They're men. You only spend money. The silence after that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. It hadn't. He was just sitting in it, and I let him. My mother called twice before I agreed to come to Sunday dinner. The second call, she said, "It's just family, Vanessa, just dinner. Nobody's going to make it into something." She believed that when she said it. I believe she genuinely believed it. The table was set the way it always was on Sundays. The good china, the cloth napkins, the centerpiece Renee changed with the seasons. Everything looked exactly like it had for 20 years. That's the thing about family rituals. They create the illusion that the underlying reality hasn't shifted. You sit in the same chairs, you pass the same dishes, you think maybe we can still be the people we were. We got through the soup. We got through most of the entree. Then Gerald set down his fork and said, with the measured tone of a man who has been thinking about an opening line for several days, that he wanted to talk about the future of the family, meaning the business, and what role, if any, Vanessa saw herself playing going forward. He had an offer: Senior Vice President of Operations, equity stake in the company, full authority over service delivery, quality standards, and client relationships. A salary he described as competitive, which I calculated in about 4 seconds would have represented roughly double what I'd been earning when I left. Double what I'd been earning. Still less than what my company was currently generating for me. Troy was nodding along like this was a great idea he'd just thought of himself. Damon was watching me with the expression of a man who has already run the math and isn't sure how this ends. Renee smiled hopefully across the table. I looked at my father. "Let me make sure I understand this," I said. "You want me to close Meridian Property Group, walk away from the clients who sought me out specifically, leave behind the company I built from a secondhand desk and a single-cup coffee maker, and come work for you in exchange for what should have been offered 6 years ago. It's a generous offer, Vanessa. It would have been generous 6 years ago. Right now, it's a rescue strategy." Gerald's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to do right by this family." "You had 6 years to do right by this family. You paid me $42,000 a year, while my brothers made twice that for doing half the work, and when I asked why, you told me it was because they're men." I set my own fork down. My voice was level. I was not performing calm. I actually was calm, which surprised me more than anyone. That was not a mistake, Dad. That was a belief, and I can't come back to work for someone whose belief about my value is that it's less than my brother's by virtue of what I am. "You're being dramatic," he said. There it was, dramatic. The word that has been used to end conversations about women's legitimate grievances for as long as there have been women and legitimate grievances. "No," I said, "I'm being precise." I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was lovely as always." I got my coat. I said goodnight to everyone in the room. I drove home, and I sat in my parking spot for a while with the radio off, watching the light in other people's windows. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been repaired. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, in the room where it needed to be said, to the people who needed to hear it. That was enough for one Sunday. David Blackstone called my direct office line on a Wednesday afternoon in September. I had worked with his company for 3 years at Mitchell & Associates. Blackstone Properties held 12 commercial buildings across the city, a portfolio worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million in managed assets. He was one of the most demanding clients I had ever served, and one of the fairest. He expected excellence, and he paid for excellence, and he had zero interest in explanations for why excellence had not been delivered. Ms. Mitchell, he said, because David Blackstone was the kind of man who used last names. "I understand you've started your own operation." "I have. Meridian Property Group. We've been operating for 8 months. I've been watching what's happening with your former accounts. The Morrison situation. Richardson, Patterson, I'm not an uninformed person. I didn't think you were. I've been unhappy with the service I've received from Mitchell and Associates for the past 2 quarters. I won't detail it on the phone, but I'd like to have a conversation in person about whether Meridian Property Group can meet our requirements. I looked at the wall across from my desk. At the framed copy of my business license I'd put up on month 1, not for decoration, but to remind myself every morning what I had actually done. I'd be glad to meet with you, Mr. Blackstone. I want to be honest with you up front. Your portfolio is the largest we've ever considered. I'm going to tell you exactly what we can do right now and what would require growth on our end. That's exactly the kind of answer I was hoping for, he said. We met for lunch on Friday. He spent the first 20 minutes describing what had gone wrong at Mitchell and Associates since I left. I listened without commenting on my family's management or my brother's specific failures, because that is not how I do business. I let the facts sit without editorializing them. Then he asked me directly what Meridian could take on. 4 properties to start, I told him. We build out our capacity while demonstrating performance on those 4. If we meet your standards, which we will, we discuss the remainder of the portfolio on a timeline that doesn't compromise service quality. He studied me across the table. Every other firm I've spoken to has promised me full portfolio management from day 1, he said. With respect, every other firm you've spoken to was telling you what you wanted to hear. I'm telling you what I can actually deliver. He signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. I called Keisha from the elevator on my way down. We're going to need to talk about hiring, I said. She said, I already drafted the job posting. That is why I hired Keisha. The industry newsletter came out on a Monday. Tom, my new maintenance coordinator, recruited from a larger firm where he'd been slowly losing his mind in bureaucratic inefficiency, brought it to my desk with the energy of someone delivering interesting news they are trying not to enjoy too much. Mitchell and Associates restructures operations following client portfolio changes. I read the article twice. It was professionally written in the way that trade publications write about struggling companies, all euphemism and neutral framing, restructured operations, scaled back expansion, strategic review of service delivery model, every phrase a translation of something simpler that no one wanted to print directly. Gerald was losing ground. The accounts I had built, the relationships I had maintained, the systems I had created, the trust I had earned over 6 years, had not belonged to Mitchell and Associates. They had belonged to the work, and the work had walked out with me. I set the newsletter on my desk. I had 3 client calls that morning and a site visit in the afternoon, and a new vendor contract to review before end of day. I did not celebrate. I did not call anyone to share the news. I made a cup of coffee and I went back to work, because that is the thing about building something based on merit. The meter keeps running. Yesterday's performance does not carry today, but I will tell you this. I kept that newsletter. I folded it and put it in the file drawer where I kept documents that mattered, not as a trophy, as a record. Some records exist to remind you what the stakes were when you decided to bet on yourself. My mother decorated the house the same way she had decorated it for 30 years, garland on the banister, the ceramic nativity scene on the entry table that my grandmother had given her, the artificial tree with the white lights and the ornaments that went back to my childhood, the ones I'd made in elementary school that she'd kept, even though they were lopsided and uneven and made from clothespins and glitter glue. Everything looked like home. Everything felt like a negotiation. Damon and Troy were already there when I arrived. They'd been there long enough to have drinks and to have had whatever conversation they decided to have before I walked in. I could tell by the way they both shifted slightly when I came through the door. Gerald came out of his study with his hosting smile, the one reserved for business dinners with clients he wasn't sure about yet. Renee hugged me and said I looked wonderful and offered me wine before I had even taken my coat off. We made it through dinner on careful topics. Troy mentioned a vacation he was planning. Damon asked about the market in general, meaning not about my market specifically, a distinction he maintained with visible effort. Renee talked about the church's holiday fundraiser and the neighbor's new dog. Gerald waited until dessert. "I want to be honest with everyone at this table," he said, setting down his fork with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this moment. "The situation between Vanessa's company and ours is affecting this family. I think we need to talk about it." "You can talk about it," I said. "I'm here." The clients who have left, Richardson, Morrison, Patterson, now Blackstone's Trial Properties, those are relationships this company built over decades. "Those are relationships I built," I said, specifically, with my time and my work and my attention over years while I was being paid $42,000 a year. Troy looked at his plate. Damon looked somewhere between his plate and my face. "This family is being torn apart," Gerald said. "The family didn't tear apart when you told me what I was worth, Dad. It cracked then. What we're seeing now is just what a crack looks like when it finishes spreading." "Vanessa, I'm not angry." And I meant it. There was something past anger in me by then. Something cleaner and harder and more permanent. I'm just not pretending anymore. I'm not going to limit what I build to protect you from seeing what you lost. I'm not going to make myself smaller so this dinner feels more comfortable. I looked at my mother, who was sitting very still with her hands in her lap. I love this family, and I am not coming back to the version of it that decided I was worth less than my brothers. Gerald stood up. He said something about being dramatic and vindictive. He said something about family loyalty and competitive ethics. I put on my coat. I said Merry Christmas to my mother. I meant it. I drove home through streets lined with lights, and I kept the windows cracked because the air was cold and sharp and felt like the truth, which is to say, it felt like something you can actually breathe. The Commercial Real Estate Excellence Awards dinner was held at the Grand Ballroom downtown, the same venue where I had attended this event 3 years in a row as a Mitchell & Associates representative, name badge clipped to a blazer I'd bought on sale, sitting at the company table, watching established firms collect recognition for work that was largely performed by people like me. This year, I walked in as the owner of a nominated company. I wore a midnight blue suit I had purchased at full price. I had my business cards in my jacket pocket and my award nomination letter in a folder I didn't need to open, but had brought anyway. Old habit. Always have the documentation. Keisha, Tom, and our newest hire, Renata, were at the table with me. We had talked the week before about how to handle the evening professionally, focused on representing the company well, not on whatever else might be happening in the room. Mitchell & Associates had a table near the back. Gerald was in his standard black tuxedo. Renee was beside him in a gown I recognized from 2 years ago. Damon and Troy were there, both of them on their phones more than they were in the room. I did not go over to say hello. That was not cruelty. That was clarity. When the presenter reached the Rising Company of the Year category, she read out the metrics for each nominee. For Meridian Property Group, 340% client growth in the first operational year, 98% client satisfaction score. Over $400 million in successfully transitioned managed assets. The numbers were real. Every one of them had been earned. Rising Company of the Year, Meridian Property Group. Keisha made a sound beside me that she immediately covered by clearing her throat. Tom grinned. Renata clapped with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has been told to be professional but is very happy. I walked to the podium. 500 people in that room. Industry colleagues, potential clients, competitors, journalists from 3 trade publications, and at a table near the back, my father in his black tuxedo, my mother in her 2-year-old gown. I did not look at their table. "Thank you for this recognition," I said. Meridian Property Group exists because we believe one thing, that competence should drive client relationships, not connections. That excellence should be the standard, not the exception. and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is step away from what you know and build something better. I said thank you. I walked back to my table. After the ceremony in the hotel lobby, Gerald found me. He said, "Congratulations, that was significant." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I want you to know I'm proud of what you've built." And then, like a man who has been practicing honesty and finds it unfamiliar, even if the circumstances have been hard for the family, I looked at him. "Pride and respect aren't the same thing, Dad. And respect and equity aren't the same thing either. If you'd had all three when I was working for you, none of this would have been necessary." I picked up my award from the table behind me. "I'll see you at Christmas." I walked to my car. The award fit in the crook of my arm like it had always been there. The new year arrived with a January cold snap and an unexpected phone call. Tom appeared in my doorway with a message slip and the expression of someone delivering information they find personally satisfying. "Paulette from Mitchell and Associates is looking for a new position. She asked specifically if she could speak with you." Paulette, who had sat in that meeting 15 months ago with her notepad and her carefully averted eyes, who had made the phone call to Gerald's office instead of engaging with the evidence I'd put on her desk, who had known, for a long time, what was happening in that company and had said nothing. I scheduled the interview. She came in on a Thursday, professional as ever in a gray blazer and low heels. She sat across from me at the same desk I'd bought secondhand in March of last year, and she was direct in the way that people are direct when they've stopped pretending. "Gerald implemented performance-based evaluations for all staff in January," she said. "Objective metrics, measurable targets, accountability structures." "Good," I said. "Your brothers are struggling with the new expectations." She said it without satisfaction, which told me she'd thought about how to say it. "They're not used to being measured by results." No, they wouldn't be. "The environment has become difficult," she continued, "for staff who've been there a long time, for people who believed in the company as it was, who are watching it change in ways that feel reactive rather than principled." She folded her hands on the table. "I've been there 17 years, Vanessa. I should have spoken up a long time ago. I know that." I let that sit for a moment. "What can you bring to Meridian?" I asked. She could bring 17 years of HR infrastructure knowledge. She could bring recruitment systems and compliance frameworks and the institutional memory of everything that had been done wrong, which is often more valuable than a textbook on how to do it right. I offered her the position that afternoon. She started the following Monday. By her second week, she had redesigned our onboarding process from scratch, which saved us approximately 40 hours of redundant effort every time we brought someone new in. The week she joined, I received 2 more calls from Mitchell and Associates employees inquiring about opportunities. Word was traveling. Gerald's attempt to rebuild his company on merit-based principles had arrived about 15 years too late for the people who'd watched him manage by favoritism for 2 decades. They were leaving. Some of them were coming to me. The industry newsletter that month noted that Mitchell and Associates had experienced its 4th consecutive quarter of declining revenue. I read the item. I set the newsletter in the file drawer. Then I went back to work. Spring. The industry newsletter's spring edition ran a small item on page 4, between a development firm's new hire announcement and an update on downtown zoning regulations. Mitchell and Associates, founded in 1991 by Gerald Mitchell, has been acquired by Southeastern Property Partners following a strategic review process. Gerald Mitchell will transition out of the managing director role effective April 30th. I read it at my desk on a Tuesday morning with my coffee. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had thought, in the months before, that when this moment came, I would feel something large, triumph or grief, or some complicated hybrid of the two. Instead, I felt something quieter, a kind of settling. The way a building feels when the last piece of structural work is done and everything that's been held in suspension can finally come to rest. My father built that company from nothing. Whatever his failures, and they were real, and they cost me years I cannot get back, he had built something real. It had just turned out that part of what made it real was me. And when I left, that part went with me. The same newsletter, on page 2, ran a profile of the year's standout commercial real estate firms. Meridian Property Group had been named Firm of the Year. The profile included a photo of our team, Keisha, Tom, Paulette, Renata, and 3 people we'd hired in the last quarter to keep pace with the Blackstone expansion, which had moved, as agreed, from 4 properties to 9, with the remainder of the portfolio under active transition planning. 23 employees total, all compensated on performance metrics that I had designed from scratch, with full transparency and no exceptions for family members, because I don't have any family members in this company, and if I ever did, the metrics would apply to them the same as everyone else. $800 million in managed assets, 99th percentile client satisfaction, a client retention rate. I don't say out loud in meetings because it sounds like bragging, but which I review every month with the same private satisfaction. I felt the first morning I sat at a secondhand desk and drank bad coffee and believed this was possible. I am 31 years old. I still use the same single-cup coffee maker from that first March. It is not quiet and it is not fancy, and it makes a good cup of coffee, and I have learned to be very selective about what I replace and what I keep. The things that got you here deserve a certain respect. My father called me on a Sunday in February, after the acquisition had been announced, but before it had closed. He asked if I would have lunch with him, just the 2 of us. I said yes. We sat across from each other in a restaurant we'd never been to together, which meant it was neutral ground, which I think was his intention. He said he had been thinking about the things he'd said in his office 15 months ago. He said he understood now, and I could see that he was trying, that this cost him something, that what he had done was not fair, not to me, not to the standard his company claimed to hold itself to. He did not say he was sorry in those exact words. Gerald Mitchell is not a man who has ever learned to use that sentence comfortably, but he said enough. He said it in the language available to him. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I was not carrying it anymore, that I had set it down somewhere in the process of building something that proved I didn't need to carry it, that the anger had been useful, the same way fuel is useful, but you can't live in the tank. He nodded. He looked older than I'd ever seen him look. Not diminished, exactly. Just more accurately sized than he had been when he sat behind that massive oak desk and laughed at the idea that someone without a Mitchell & Associates business card could build something worth having. We split the check. We walked to our separate cars. He hugged me before we separated. Briefly, slightly awkwardly, the hug of a man still learning that this is the kind of moment that requires one. I drove back to the office. I had a client call at 2 o'clock, a staff review at 4, and a lease renewal to finalize before end of day. The woman my father said only spends money has built something worth more than what he sold. I am not done yet. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.